All right. Well, how are you guys doing? Good. Very good. All right. Okay. Well, I was up really late last night thinking about Counterpoint. So there's a lot of good stuff. Stuff can be quite consumptive. So I guess we can start out by talking about some inventions, things like that. And then we can kind of go on to fugues. Inventions provide a kind of close corollary to the fugue. In fact, just to kind of ease your anxieties, I'll say this. The exercise, the actual, let's see if I can find it. Huh. Give me a second. Okay, well, I guess what I was going to say is that your assignment could be as short as 8 measures long. From the standpoint that what you really have is, we'll talk about this in a second, but you basically have a subject. You have to imitate the subject. You have to have the other voice imitate the subject. You have a bridge, and then you have 3 voices where one voice states the subject. So it's not a terribly long assignment, but it is the only assignment we'll have going forward. And everything that we'll do going forward will be incremental towards that goal. And we'll do in-class activities discussing like sequencing and things like that. But fear not, it's not a very elaborate assignment. If I could find the actual, I put it somewhere, but you can see it's on the order of magnitude of something like this. And this is even longer than so. So it's not so bad. In fact, let's actually just talk about inventions first, okay? They're an important form, and in some ways they're more difficult to comprehend than fugue. So the overall construction of an invention is you have initial statements of a motive, and you have them sort of in the tonic and dominant area. We'll talk about that. You have episodes, and then after that you have some middle entries in a different key, even more middle entries in a different key, and then you have a final statement. So already this is very similar to a fugue. The only difference, I guess I would say, is that you basically insert another initial statement after this bridge or episode, and that's basically the essence of a fugue. Just these fugal exposition, just the first 3 aspects of this chart if we include another slight entrance of another motive. So I guess I'll talk a little bit about motives. They're the smallest unit of a melodic phrase. And by the way, can you hear this? Okay, cool. They have a defining melodic, rhythmic, and melodic contour. And really, I guess the point of describing things in terms of motives is really for the sake of analysis. You're trying to find something that checks out in terms of what you're expecting in terms of the invention form. So it's really the semantics that you use are really deterministic based on what you see in the score in front of you. So you can make arguments like, oh, this is not really, the motive's actually all of this. You might make some statement that the motive's even longer, but in the sake of analysis, the most useful way to describe a motive for the sake of invention analysis is by thinking about it in terms of finding something where the pattern is repeated, and you could find that repeated pattern, and thus you string 2 motives together through imitation. We'll get more to that, but motives define the key and rhythmic structure, so they have some sort of defining property. And if there is a situation where the motive does not clearly define a key, then some free counterpoint in the other voice can kind of suggest the key a little bit more. Or a counter motive can actually suggest the key as well. But I guess for most common purposes, especially for the case of your fugue and your fugue subjects, the actual motive you use as the subject, the figure you use will be, or I guess the line you use will be somewhat close to the key. And most of the time, the actual first note of the motive that you use for your fugue will actually be in the key, will actually be the tonic of the key. So that's one piece of information. I already talked about how defining a motive and counter motive is somewhat subjective endeavor, but I guess a good rule of thumb is if you see a motive appear later, it's worth defining. So for instance, I talked about that. You see a motive here and then you see it over here. That's probably a useful basis for you to actually define the motives, okay? Okay. So for instance, we're going to elaborate on some of these inventions through later exercises, but you know, you have right? You have the motive in the right hand, and then you have the motive basically imitated in the left hand, and then you have the motive again in the right hand, and you have the motive again imitated in the left hand. And there's some significant information about these imitations pertaining to key areas of these imitations. This becomes really important when we talk about fugue, so it's important to understand this. In fact, when I've been reading the Kennan book, which is a really good book that I put on the Google Drive, most of the discussion about fugue actually is talked about in concert in the invention chapters and the three voice counterpoint chapters. By the time you get to the fugue section, it's already assumed that you understand all of these tonic dominant relationships and the ways that you could the different key areas in which different motives can interact with each other. So we're going to look at that a little bit more. Some motives can be really long. So again, this is all jurisdicted on the actual piece of music. You can't make a hard and fast rule that a motive is just 2 measures or 1 measure. You have to look at the actual music, and then you have to make a useful definition that helps you analyze it. Because analysis is your friend, ultimately. It's not abstract. So in this particular case, the motive is actually this long. And the counter motive is actually this long. And then you have the motive again. The reason you know it's the motive is because you see this entire statement appear verbatim again in the bottom voice. And then you see the statement appear, the counter motive appear in the top voice. So just to kind of clarify what a motive and a counter motive is, the distinction that I want to make is, well, for sometimes the significance of one is over the other isn't necessarily so clear. Like there's not necessarily a hierarchical relationship where like the motive is superior to the counter motive. They might actually both have equal playing ground, as Bach sometimes does. But you know, in this particular case, it kind of seems as though the counter motive's a little more ancillary. I'll struggle playing this. Right? The counter motive has sort of a what am I trying to say? Accompanimental feature. But you know, it's a subjective endeavor to even describe one as being more important than the other. But I will say this: when you compare a counter motive to just like pure free counterpoint, that can be a significant difference. So, for instance, these first 2 notes do not make up a counter motive, from the standpoint that there's nothing recurring about these 2 notes. So, an important fact about a counter motive, or I guess when you get to the fugue, when you start, if you implement a counter subject, is that the counter motive always occurs in concert with the motive, and it recurs. Whereas this little thing right here is just free counterpoint, just to kind of help the key be established a little bit more thoroughly. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. Okay, same pictures. Wait, they are the same pictures, but okay. Okay, so the imitation. As I was saying, if you have the voice introduced, sorry, if you have the motif introduced in one voice, you have it imitated in the other voice. And the two basic possibilities that the imitation, the points of interval of imitation that could occur, are the fifth and the octave. So what you see here, actually, I guess I'll ask the class. Ooh, there's a little distorted sound in my Rhodes patch. What is the interval of imitation here? Someone spacebar in and let me know. Yeah, incidentally, if you don't press spacebar while typing, or while trying to talk back in, it won't work. Oh, but also
It's just an octave.
It's just an octave. So this is the case of imitation at the octave. Great. Okay. So now this long motive. So incidentally, you compare the first note of the announcement with the first note of the imitation, of the announcement in the imitation. Sorry, in the imitation, right? So basically you compare this note with this note and you get an octave. And remember, we're comparing the motives. We're not really concerned about the counter motives, even though they may or may not match. We're not sure. We're concerned about the motive. So in this particular long case, two-part invention number 5, this motive is quite long. In fact, we can actually listen to this. I'm not going to play it. Bach invention 5. It's super blurring too. Okay. Urtext edition, nice. Cool, right? So I guess what I'll talk about here, I'll ask the class again. What is the interval of imitation right here between the motive and the imitation of the motive? What is the interval of imitation? By the way, if you use the talkback button, it takes a second to engage, so I might not hear you if you just press it. You have to hold it for a sec before it engages. So basically, we're looking at this note, and we're looking at this note. Anyone have any ideas?
Fifth.
Fifth, absolutely. It is a perfect fifth. That is a totally viable candidate. And I'll say this, those are actually the two candidates that we're concerned about. And this is actually very fugue-like already. From the standpoint of this, you're expecting a statement in the tonic area, and then you're eventually expecting a statement in the dominant key area. It's also reminiscent of sonata form as well. You want to kind of establish these two key areas at some point, and at some point you do have to bring them up. So let's see. This part right here, I guess I mentioned this part already, that these two notes are free counterpoint, and this right here is the counter motive. I already talked about that. Okay, so some potential plans of the initial announcements, okay? So what we have, basically in this particular first example, is we have the motive, and then we have the counter motive, and we actually, I guess I can annotate this a little bit more. We actually have the motive in the 1 key area. Then we have the motive again in the 1 key area, right? And counter motive in the 1 key area. And then we have a motive in the 5 key area. Counter motive is in the 5 key area, motive as well. Okay, so this is one possible plan. This is different actually than the second one that we just listened to. In this particular case, we have the motive in the 1 key area, and we have the counter motive happening at the same exact time in the 1 key area. And then, oh yeah, actually says dominant level, tonic key, dominant level, great. But just to be more verbose. That's what you get, right? So when would you do this and when would you do this? Well, there are many, many pages of examples in the book of when you would do this and when you would do this, down to the number of how many inventions do this and how many inventions do this and how many inventions do another thing. You have some latitude to create at this stage. One could say that because this motive is so long, it might not be wise to necessarily repeat the motive and the counter motive, or to repeat the counter motive in the one key area as well. Like over here, you kind of have the one key area appear 3 times. Over here, you just have it once. We have it twice. So they might. One argument you could say is, well, this was so much. We spent so much time in the one key area by virtue of the fact that this was a 4-measure statement that we might as well just go to the 5 key area. But interestingly, invention 9 actually decides to do just that. It actually has the motive and counter motive in the 1 key area, and then it flipped counter motive and motive in the 1 key area. So that's all to say that you can really do a lot of things. In fact, Bach investigated all the different permutations and possibilities. He pushed the limit with these kind of ideas. So it's interesting. There's no hard and fast rules. Well, yes, there are. We've studied a lot of them, but there is also a lot of license for creativity and subjective explorations. So that's interesting, right? Does everyone follow why I describe this in this way? How the motive and the counter motive are both in the tonic key area, whereas over here, right? If I go here, I'm in the key of G major. This is where I'm referencing the G major tonality at this point in time, right? Versus here, I'm referencing the C major tonality. Here, I'm referencing the G major tonality, okay? Similarly, this is super blurry, and I don't know this one very well, but you've heard it earlier. This is all referencing E flat major, right? And then over here, you're referencing B flat major. Whoops. Ooh. Right. So we're in the 5 key area, right? Key area of the dominant. Cool. Okay. Okay, so I guess some other interesting features of the inventions, which are inventive and fun to look at. Bach's invention number 8. Right? This one right here actually employs a canonic construction. You guys remember we were talking about canon? We were talking about how basically canon is basic. Let me zoom in a little bit. Canon is basically the idea of having the melodic statement basically be imitated in the other voice at a certain interval. So in this case, there's actually no like counter motive necessarily. Like it's basically, I mean, I guess this is canonic from the sense that this entire thing, it's an extended canonic creation, I should say, because there's canonic elements of the other aspects as well. Because basically, whenever you repeat something after a certain interval of time, it's a canon. But what's interesting about this is an extended canon, where there's a lot of overlap, and that's another feature of canonic writing often, that there's overlap. So this is interesting. Inventions 2 and 8 employ an extended canonic construction of the first portion. Okay, so this one right here is also very interesting. Two-part invention number 6. Well, look at that. There's some musical analysis here. Okay. Does this remind you of anything in terms of a specific species?
Fourth species.
Yeah, it's fourth species city over here. And another thing about this one that's very interesting, yeah, fourth species, it's kind of displaced, right? There's lots of interesting things about this one. For one, the motive and the counter motive are almost like identical. So in some ways, you can kind of think of this as like a canon, where the bottom one is inverted, and they're at a very close stretto. And remember, stretto means tight in Italian. And it's basically, the book refers to this as two coordinate motives. And it's hard to know which one's more significant. And also there's some invertible counterpoint, right? Eventually this one goes up an octave, right? And then this voice goes down an octave. So that's interesting, right? So there's so many different ways you can play around with this stuff. The inventions are very inventive and they're worth studying. There's lots of good stuff in there. Oh, interesting. Okay. Let's see. This is a great one. Now this one right here, a new motive is actually discovered in the episodic development. And you know what, I'll play it. Bach, two-part invention number 13. That's cool. Someone actually went through and analyzed all these to some degree. Okay, so we haven't talked about the episodic development yet. But what's interesting is a lot of times in the episodic development section where there's really a sequence happening, there's actually this idea that you reuse some of the main motives from the original section of the piece, from the original statement section where the first statement is repeated and imitated, and there's invertible counterpoint and in different key areas. So a lot of times these motives are actually repeated. But what's interesting about this section is that there's sort of a new motive that gets introduced and imitated in the development section. So that's interesting. But let's actually talk about that really quickly. Oh, before I do, one thing you could do with motives, which probably is somewhat clear right now after we talked about all this stuff with in the context of canons last class, is that you can kind of mess around with the actual motives, right? You can augment them. You can have the motives have melodic inversion or contrary motion. You could do retrograde. You can change the interval, diminution. You can do all kinds of stuff. And you're still kind of adhering to the idea that the motive is the motive by any other means, okay? But let's actually talk about episodes. Okay. So episodes are nearly always sequential. This is the episode, right? That's the episode. You hear the falling fifths. Right, you hear the autumn leaves progression right there, right? This is very common. This is something that we're going to start getting more familiar with as we have to do something like this in our fugues. So there's already lots of corollaries that I'll explain more thoroughly, but episodes have that sequential characteristic. So, you know, you have, in this particular case, I guess if we're analyzing it, you have the motive, the counter motive, then you have the motive in the other voice, and then you have the episode. Right, and then so there are functions that these episodes accomplish. And one is they actually allow you to modulate from the key of one statement to the key of another statement. But they also just provide relief and interest because everyone just likes autumn leaves, right? Even Bach liked autumn leaves. It's just a great progression. And it's a falling fifths progression. And we'll talk more about that over time. But I guess what I want to get in your head so far is this principle right here is so vital to your fugal exposition. This is just this is basically half of what you have to do. There's really 4 parts. In fact, it's not so terrible if you think about it in this way. You have a motive, and then you basically have the restatement of the motive in another voice with some sort of counter melody. That's half of it. So like this much is already like half of your assignment, okay? And then after that, you basically have an episode that basically sequences you. In this case, I mean, in the case of a fugue, it'll sequence you back to the original key area or a different key area. And then you basically have a statement where you have 3 voices. And one of the voices is actually stating the fugal subject. And the other voices are just ancillary 3-voice counterpoint, of which I haven't fleshed out these pages, but it's not that difficult. 3-voice counterpoint, you're just basically fleshing out 2-voice counterpoint. Because you've already done the harmonic analysis for all of your 2-voice counterpoint, you're just basically inserting extra notes, essentially. So it's not so bad. But anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself, just foreshadowing what's to come. Okay, so middle entries. So, you know, earlier I was giving you this kind of bird's eye picture of what was going on. Let's just kind of let's have a little checkpoint here. We have the initial statements of the motive, right? In the tonic and dominant. And then we have an episode modulating to 5 or 6 if basic key is major, 3 if minor. Okay, we're about to talk about that. And then we have some middle entries in the key, right? Some middle entries in the piece. We have more middle entries, and then we have a final statement of the motive in the tonic. So this might be fun, you know, looking at one of these graphical scores to actually look at this and think about it. Before we do, I just want to explain what a middle entry is. It's borrowed from fugue terminology, so that's good. You don't actually have to get to the middle entry. You basically stop on your fugue exposition when you get to the middle entry. It's like the development section of a sonata. And they're basically, they're applied to the statements of the motive that occur after the initial statements, and normally after the episode, an intervening episode, and before the closing section of the tonic. So it's the middle section. A cadence in a key other than the tonic generally precedes the section in which the middle entries appear. So that kind of makes sense. You're basically restating the invention motives in different keys. So it kind of makes sense that you have to cadence in a previous key in order to get there, right? So a lot of times these keys that you get to in the middle entries are just very closely related. So you might have a middle entry in the dominant, you might have a middle entry in the subdominant, in the mediant, in the submediant, right? In major, you might have it on the supertonic. So in the minor, you might have it on the subtonic, right? These are all more or less 2 or less sharps and flats from the original key. So it's not that much, you know, you don't want to be in a really, really distant key when you have middle entries. Not to say that you will, because you're not going to have to complete this part, but this is important to know because just to understand the basic skeletal structure of fugue and an invention, it's important to know as we analyze throughout the rest of the semester. Final statements, not much there. You have a couple of statements of the motive in the tonic key, and you have a strong cadence at the end. Yeah, and then there's a bunch of tips for analyzing motives, analyzing inventions. But just, especially pertaining to these 5 basic, well, the overall construction, you know, the characteristics of the motive, the imitation, the announcements, just basically how do you segment this in order to get something like this? So just to recap, the initial statements of the motive, you have an episode, right? And then basically you have some middle entries in closely related keys. And then you have the final statement of the motive. Okay? So let's actually look at this one. Actually, F major one is, I think. It doesn't actually label the sections, but I'll say them as they come. Okay, in the dominant, or it could be a middle entry. Sequence. More sequence. You hear the initial statement of the motive, but at the very end. This is more unusual. Let's take a look at this is actually one of the ones that Bach, one of the ones that Kennan actually mentioned as being a little strange because there's canonic construction of the motives. Let's take a look at the A minor one. Or sorry, D minor. Okay, main motif and the version. Restatement. Episode. Restatement of the motive in the relative major. Cadence in a new key, middle entry. We're in a new key here. Sequence. Original theme. Closing material. Cool, huh? All right. So these inventions are so fun. They're incredible. I would play through them and just enjoy them. They're amazing, and there's so much to learn. I'm very grateful to learn more about a lot of these. I knew a few of them, but there's so many of them. I think there's 30 of them. And actually there's 15 two-part ones and there's 15 three-part ones. And the three-part ones are actually very similar to Fugue. But they really challenge your brain, and they're very rewarding and fun. So anyway, to the Fugue we go. Any questions about any of this, by the way? I know that's a lot of information. I am recording this. I actually recorded the last class and I put it on YouTube too. So I know some of you guys, one of the students couldn't come, so I put it on there. So if it's unclear, just it's probably unbearable to rewatch this, but you could look at it and check it out. Anyway, so for a fugue, there's an exposition, which is the first part of the fugue, and the subject is announced in imitative fashion according to a traditional pattern, very similar so far to an invention, right? Subject announced, you have it imitated, right? Then you have a freer portion called the development section. Well, those are like, I guess some of these include some middle entries, right? Just like the invention. And then you have some reference to the subject and the tonic key near the end. It could be some portion of the subject to complete an emphatic statement, full-fledged recapitulation. So we listened to that invention in F major, and I think it was the first invention I just played while I was shouting out the analysis points, and it wasn't really like a full-fledged restatement of all the motivic themes. It basically had portions of it, but it was still definable enough for you to know that it's the fugue subject, right? So ultimately what this is saying is you just have to return back to the subject and sort of connect it in such a way where it still feels like the subject at the end. So obviously there's some ABA principle here, just like in the invention. Okay, the subject, while we're on the subject, they can vary considerably in length. Some are very short as one measure, and some are as long as 8 or more measures. So this relatively short subject is a soggetto. This is actually like the average length of a subject in the well-tempered clavier. Oh, I think I found the slide that well, maybe not. I was looking for the slide that I was looking for earlier. That's okay. Then you have a relatively long subject, an andamento. Interesting, right? So if you use a subject like this, your fugal exposition is going to be quite long. So I don't think any of you guys will probably write a subject like this. Because you can actually write an entire exposition in this length. But nothing saying you can't. So just like an invention motive, it should be recognizable. It should be melodically distinct, rhythmically distinct. You know, for instance, we have this little motive right here. This is the wedge fugue by Bach. Alternating intervals make the subject very recognizable. Whoops. Whoops. Am I doing this wrong? I think I'm doing this wrong. Oh, there we go. Cool. Cool. All right. So that's a very distinct melody. It seems like a nightmare to write against because there's so much chromaticism, but I guess you can do it. Okay, this one's by Purcell. I mean, these are all pretty straightforward. They're just nice melodies. Importantly, a good fugue subject should have an interesting contour with a climax point not placed too close to the beginning. Okay. Subject should not use period construction. It's not characteristic of fugal writing. So you shouldn't have like an actual period. If you remember what a period is, it's basically 2 phrases, right? That's a period. Obviously, that doesn't sound like a fugue subject. You know, there's a question and answer built into that. There's a sense of harmonic relief and all the stuff that is not characteristic of a fugue subject. A subject can start on or off the beat. Oh, you know what? I've skipped this one. Subjects most often begin on the tonic, less frequently on the dominant, and rarely on any other note. In fact, there's a lot I can say about subjects that begin on the dominant. It's kind of a seminal, well, even on the tonic, tonal answers come into play, but yeah, that's a topic for later. We'll hopefully get to it. So the tonic note must be introduced near the beginning if you start on the dominant. Otherwise, the tonality can't be well defined, okay? And a subject can begin on or off the beat. A frequent arrangement is that a subject starts right after a short rest. And most fugue subjects actually don't exceed the range of an octave, but there are some slight exceptions. This is the slide I was looking for. This is basically all you have to do for the end of the year. This is 8 measures long. This is a fugal exposition. It's not so bad. Incidentally, we are meeting on finals week. This isn't anything new because when I took Counterpoint with Dutton, we met on finals week. I remember very distinctly because I had a recital and then I had basically finals week. I went and took the Counterpoint final. We're not actually taking a Counterpoint final. This is just to give you more time to write your fugal exposition. And we're just going to meet up and check in for an hour. And it's all good and dandy. In fact, do you guys know when the final is scheduled? is that information that you have somewhere, or is, because I know at UCSD they actually list that in your, like when you sign up for the class, and people freak out when they have conflicting final times. But is that just determined by the instructor, or what is the protocol?
There's like a list on the SDSU website that shows what the finals are for whatever classes, like Monday, Wednesdays, Fridays, this time.
Oh, okay. That's cool.
So I pulled up the list. I don't know if you want me to share it.
Oh yeah, can you, share it, and if you find out the time, just let me know.
Well, it says that our final would be on Friday, May 8th from 10:30 to 12:30.
Friday, May 8th. Okay. Friday, May 8th. Okay. That is, but that's not final.
Yeah.
That's not finals week though, is it?
Yeah, because it's weird. We usually end like on a Thursday and we start finals on Friday and then go into the whole next week. Okay.
Okay, gotcha. Well, I guess let's see if we can do that then. Let's do it. That's May 8th. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 days from now. Okay? Cool. All right. So this is basically the template for the fugue exposition that you have to do. You have a subject, and then you either repeat the subject in the dominant key area or you repeat it in the tonic key area, and there's reasons for doing both. And the stuff that you do when you're actually trying to harmonize the other voice with counterpoint, you can use a counter subject or you can just use free counterpoint. Both of them are probably equally hard to do. In fact, if you have to restate the subject the third time, which you do because it's a 3-voice exposition, fugal exposition, if you write the counter subject here, you can just reuse it when you have the third statement, right? So ultimately, for homework, what I would suggest you do is write a small fugue melody based on what I actually talked about as good criteria for writing a good fugue subject. And then we'll talk about how to actually we'll talk about how to actually combine the two. We'll talk about that a little bit today. And that's not so bad because now that you know how to execute counterpoint especially in the 18th century, you just execute counterpoint against the subject. So you have the subject by itself with no counterpoint, and then you have the subject again with counterpoint that you write. So this is actually much easier than the canon, where you actually have to basically adhere to all of these relationships because the subjects happen one after another. It's not like they're overlapping, or they don't have to. So I mean, this one. Sequence, and that's when it ends, right? That's it. That's the whole thing. So it's always anyway. Okay, now this is a complicated aspect of. I'll see how much I can get to on this, but I guess importantly, write your subject for next class at least. Okay, and then there's this particular criteria on how you actually. And we're going to spend a lot of time in class actually writing this too. So we'll have time during these 16 days to do it that way. So here's something that's interesting. Before I actually tell you that, the simplest way that you can have imitation is something called a real answer. It's the most straightforward. And this is when you have the subject imitated exactly a fifth above or fourth below without any change in the quality of intervals. So for instance, whoops. you have this in the key area of the 5. Okay, and you have this in the key area of 1. This works really well when your subject, in fact, this is something you might want to do when your subject, because real answers are more straightforward in some ways than the tonal answer, maybe or maybe not, is if you include lots of notes of the dominant key area in the subject, chances are you're going to have to execute a tonal answer. That's confusing. I have lots of slides on this. I racked my brain really hard trying to understand this. But it's basically this. The idea is this. This is one subject, right? Whoops. In this particular example, the subject actually begins on the 5th. Okay? Now, if you imitate this using a real answer, you'll get this. Right? Now, there's this idea that you don't necessarily, a lot of times when you start on the 5th, you go to the 4th. And instead of referencing the 5 chord, you reference the 1 chord. So you reference the 1 chord in the subject, and you reference the 1 chord in the answer. This is what they call a tonal answer, where you reference the 1 chord in the subject, and then you change the interval slightly so that you reference a 1 chord in the answer. We're out of time, but I guess if you're spooked out by tonal answers, just don't include a lot of incidences of dominant in your melody. They're not really that spooky, but just start on the tonic if you want to play it safe. And for instance, like, you notice how this particular fugue subject doesn't really reference the dominant note at all near the beginning. So that will probably make your life a little bit easier if you want a real answer. But I haven't really explained what those things are, so we'll explain that next time. But in the meantime, just write some subjects and just get your fugue started, the fugue party started. Any questions about any of or all of that? No, that was a lot of talking, a lot of stuff, but it'll be on YouTube in case you want to torture yourself and watch this again.
I think I'll try out whatever, and I guess if I do it wrong, we'll see next class.
Sure. Yeah, just try it out. It's yeah. Thanks, Christian. Yeah. It's not so bad. I think you'll have a good time with this to some degree, especially those people who like 18th century counterpoint. Yeah, it's not so bad. But start working now, I would say.